The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Helene Geismar-Katz, Director of the Group Service Department here at the Y, and I'm happy to welcome you here to the second of our Shape of the City series. A little Y business first. For those of you who have not received your whole Y catalog in the mail, they are now out on the racks, so please pick one up as you leave this evening. Registration, we are happy to say, has been very heavy, and so if there is something that you see in the catalog that you're interested in, please call us or send in your registration as soon as you can. We don't want any of our regular customers locked out of anything that they want to come to see. So please. That's it for the business. Now, let me introduce to you our moderator. Paul Goldberger, as we spoke last time we got together a few weeks ago, has done many things in his life, but this evening I want to tell you a little bit about his writings. He is the author of The City Observed, New York, An Architectural Guide to Manhattan, The Skyscraper, On the Rise, Architecture and Design in a Postmodern Age, and Houses of the Hamptons. He has also written essays for books on the work of Richard Haas, Hugh Ferris, and Peter B. Kaplan. Of his book, The City Observed, it was written that it was the best thing of its kind yet to appear. And the reviewer went on to say that Paul Goldberger takes his place alongside Lewis Mumford and Ada Louise Huxtable, the pick of the best who have written about the American building art. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Mr. Paul Goldberger.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone here, both those who have been with this series since its earlier sessions and to those who are joining us for the first time. Just a couple of words about the series itself, and then about this evening's format before I introduce our guest tonight. As those of you who have attended these evenings know, the program consists of three parts. Our guest will begin the evening with a short introduction of slides of his work, followed by what I guess is the heart of the program, an informal conversation that will use the slides as a kind of beginning point, but go off on any tangents that it seems to lead us to. And then the final portion allows you to take us off in tangents beyond those that we've discovered ourselves. It's your questions. Please, at any point during the evening, jot a question that occurs to you down on the index cards that the ushers have either given you already or can give you if you signal. And toward the end of our conversation, they'll go up and down the aisles, collect them, pass them to the stage, and we'll present as many of them as we possibly can. Before I introduce our guest, one other final word about the ongoing series. Please remember that this year, for the first time, this series does not appear on consecutive weeks, but kind of falls here and there in the calendar. Our next event comes up in less than a week. It's Wednesday, January 9th, when Todd Williams and Billy Tien, partners in their own New York firm, will be here. We then skip to January 24th, when Paul Rudolph is our guest. We then adjourn for about a month, and then on February 26th, Charles Moore, who has just been announced as the winner of the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal for 1990, will be here. On March 5th, Alan Greenberg, the classicist based now in Washington, will be here. That was originally to have been the final night of this year's series. I'm happy to announce right now that we're adding an unprecedented seventh session rather. Arata Isozaki will be with us on Sunday, January 7th. The first time this series has met on a Sunday, and it will be at 4 o'clock in this room. Tickets for the Isozaki event will go on sale toward the end of this month. A good time to buy them will be before the Paul Rudolph evening on the 24th, when they should be in the box office. Please don't delay too much beyond that. Your applause represents feelings felt by a lot of people, and we expect that will be in great demand. The Isozaki evening will come shortly after the opening of a retrospective of his work at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, and will mark, among other things, Isozaki's 60th birthday. Our guest tonight comes from not Tokyo, but Lafayette Street, downtown. Less of a distance in miles, but he is as important a presence in the world of architecture and urban design. Stan Eckstut is the design partner of Ehrenkrantz, Eckstut, and Whitelaw. He is one of the preeminent urban designers in the world today. Received his Master of Architecture degree from Penn. Began his drift from pure architecture toward urban design with the New York City Urban Design Group. Later became a partner in the firm of Cooper, Eckstut and Associates, where he worked as the primary designer in one of the most significant urban design projects, not only of this city, but of this country in the last generation, the master plan for Battery Park City in Lower Manhattan, where most specifically he was principal in charge of the much acclaimed riverfront esplanade design. Stan Eckstut now has taken over as design partner, as I said, of Ehrenkrantz, Eckstut, and Whitelaw in Lower Manhattan, where he is busy working on projects not only in this part of the country, but on the West Coast, in Cleveland, and elsewhere around the world. He is a trustee of the National Building Museum and the former director of the Urban Design Program at Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Stan Eckstut. I'm reminded that I said January 7th for Isozaki. Please do not show up on January 7th. You'll be very disappointed. April 7th, Sunday afternoon, the 4th. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I have been asked to give you a visual display of the work without a lot of explanation, so I have followed those instructions. I have therefore not prepared a presentation, but I have spent a fair amount of time trying to put some slides in the right order. I'm going to begin with 3 sketches and talk about those and hope that the rest of the work is informed by the first 3 sketches. This is a sketch that I've made from the Circle Line Tour, and I've made many more of the same Circle Line Tour, and it's all about my architectural interest in interpreting the city, and I've always found it and continue to find it extremely messy, not easy to understand, and very difficult to rationalize. So in many ways, that's pretty much been the objective of my work, is to do more of the same. And it could be a much smaller city, such as here in Fells Point in Baltimore, where, although the density and the heights are much lower, the complexity of it all is what is the most appealing and most interesting. This is a sketch for one of our projects, Newport, where immediately the difficulty of doing large-scale work becomes apparent because of the problem of trying to create that kind of complexity, the multiplicity of ideas, the richness, the messiness, all the unknown parts and the pieces that aren't designed are really much more difficult to do than designing on a conscious basis all these pieces. So naturally, I'll begin with Battery Park City. It's probably one that you all know so well. I would just like to say that it's not a grid, which is what most people think of it as being. It's far from it. There's not one street and one block that's like any other, and it's not repetitive in any manner whatsoever. It's a much more complicated piece. The plan is obviously one relying on lots of emphasis on public open space. Everything is based on incremental, familiar, and tying into existing conditions rather than inventing new. And of course, it starts with a love and an interest, most of all, in the city itself, and that's where it draws upon all of its strength. As opposed to the original view and vision of Battery Park City, which failed, which sort of negated and ignored everything about New York. And what's most interesting is to see the comparison of the kind of sketch of a street which really became the Battery Park City plan. You know, I was told that this would be in focus. Is there somebody in charge? Or is it me? Okay, good. There are a lot of rules that have been written for each of the buildings to be done, and there's been a lot of criticism of trying to anticipate all of the building shapes, heights, entrances, etc., before any architects are selected. I personally believe that's created more design opportunities for architects, not less, as witnessed by the first phase of Rector Place. And I'm sure there'll probably be questions about guidelines, so I won't comment on them now. But it's all about creating the public streets of Battery Park City and how those buildings act to create the street environment as compared to space that's left over, or the esplanade, which truly is what most people think of Battery Park City. It's again that emphasis on the public space. And I might add a lot of familiar references. Today, as I look back, probably too familiar for me, but nevertheless, it was very successful. In my latest work with the artist Mary Miss in the South Cove, which has taken the esplanade into yet another set of ideas and variations. Arvern is the latest project of our office, following many of the same ideas, but interpreting probably more the borough of Queens. Obviously a very large project. I'm not going to mention numbers because all these projects are so huge that it would sound like, you know, it was just a lot of bravado, but it's obviously very large scale and all about trying to find ways of making it small, not large. In the case of Arvern, it's really trying to interpret Queens and to find ways of being softer and smaller and probably more conventional rather than less. And it all comes down to how do you start in the phase one. And if there's a way of solving large-scale work, it's probably most of all based on how you solve the first phase. If I can get a focus. This is the image most of all that we wish to convey about the smallness of Queens and its domestic quality as opposed to a commercial orientation or an attraction, etc. It's a beachfront of Queens. A current project that we're very much involved in is extending the Baltimore's Inner Harbor. This lower right-hand corner is a new residential neighborhood. It is kind of intimidating to go to America's most successful waterfront and be given the opportunity of adding onto it. And I was originally asked to think about another attraction. And the most important thing I want to say about the Baltimore work is the attraction is something that's an authentic Baltimore neighborhood. It sits at the very eastern end of the Inner Harbor itself. And it's trying very much to learn from the Baltimore neighborhoods, which rely a great deal on small-scale 2- and 3-story red brick row homes. The problem for us always is we're asked to do urban environments, and in other cities beyond New York, it's with suburban parking ratios. So we have had to invent new block sizes to bring the parking into the middle of the blocks and out of sight. I think this is probably one of the more interesting images because it's about creating that kind of messiness, the unpredictable. It's very difficult for me to photograph any of our work, and it just doesn't fit well into magazines. And it's probably trying to invent things that are not so neat and tidy. The focus of the work, of course, are on these public environments. This is one of the main squares of this new neighborhood. And if you ask me what goes in the buildings, I would tell you just about anything that the marketplace would allow. But the heights, the shapes, materials, character are what are controlled. And this is the public esplanade that'll be the extension of the Inner Harbor, and we're doing the working drawings of this right now. I want to take you to the West Coast, San Clemente, California. If there's an area of slow growth or no growth, this is it. And the problem was to fill in the municipal parking lot and build around the hill that's on the Atlantic Ocean here, the Pacific Ocean. And the plan is primarily about a very complicated story of public environments, of gardens and overlooks and walks and terraces. And it's so complicated that it took about 20 minutes just to walk people through the complexity of the public environments. The buildings are rather straightforward. They basically wind up being no more than 4 stories high. And the whole idea was to hide a very large parking garage below grade, where under the buildings it's not really below grade. And they step up the hill like a small village on the hillside. This is a beachfront. And engaging the hill, and being very aggressive about color and form in a very contemporary way. And all of the principles that I believe in were applied to this project, and they all failed. Because in this town, there is no growth. So we're not going ahead. Honolulu is another project we completed recently, which won an RFP for a major reclamation of a waterfront. And like most cities in America, waterfronts are obviously coming back. The project here is mixed use, built around a historic tower in the foreground. And the difficulty for us was marrying this sort of Hawaiian tradition of architecture, which has pretty much been ignored in the local recent times. And we tried to revive it within contemporary architecture. At the same time, the marketplace, or festival marketplace, responded a lot more to this historic context, and we had to try to keep to it, and from that began to move out towards more and more of modern expressions and forms. This became very problematic for our client, where we were pushing a great deal for trying to interpret rather than reproduce, and I think we've pretty much talked ourselves out of the job by being insistent upon contemporary architecture, which is the real dilemma for people engaged in urban design, because familiar is a lot more reliable and it's what gets approvals. And when you begin to engage contemporary architecture, it's when you get yourself in trouble, as we have. We're interested a lot in tradition and interpreting precedents because we do, as a firm, a lot of preservation work. And in fact, we probably are unique in that we enjoy doing preservation as much as new architecture. We're now doing the Customs building with the American Indian Museum inside. And we're also doing work around the country, such as in Salt Lake City. Can I get a focus? I want to point out this one building here on the Brooklyn waterfront. It's called the Margaret Apartment House. This is a first time a high-rise modern building has been approved in a historic district, And of course, it went through years of court battles, but is now finally built. It replaced a historic landmark, the Margaret Hotel. And a lot of our work and interest was to recall as much as we could in terms of brick color and the use of glass and metal in the corner bays, but it also was trying to speak very much to the large extent of space and size of the the Lower Manhattan Harbor, and contrast that totally with an equally difficult problem of stepping down to smaller brownstones and designing the back of a building. It turned out, in my memory, if I remember correctly, I hope I do, that the back was much harder to design than the front. And in fact, the Landmarks Commission had a lot more difficulty rationalizing the historic precedent of the back of a building as opposed to the front. But when you're into this urbanism, you begin to realize that not everything is a front, far from it, and especially in New York, we tend to see the front least of all. I just want to mention a few buildings that we're doing that have been influenced a great deal by this urbanism. This is one of the new prototype elementary schools that we're doing for the Board of Ed. It's basically a kit of parts, which any one of these parts, whether they're classrooms or administration or multipurpose, could easily have been the size of a school in the past. So the problem for us was how to recreate the scale of a older residential neighborhood school and not the large building that would have been asked for by the program if you just read the numbers. So we've broken it down into as many parts as possible and have tried to create a village of many urban environments for the kids. There's a lot to tell you about this school. I'm going to just focus on the street wall because all of the neighborhood precedents for schools in New York, at least up through the 50s, were ignored afterwards, and it was very much about making the street wall and the residential scale of a 30-foot bay. And that became our obsession in this work of trying to work a street wall, and most of all, trying to find thickness to the front wall of a street. It remains something that's very evasive of creating the thicknesses of street walls that we're accustomed to in the older buildings of our city. We're also doing an addition to the criminal court building in Queens. And there's two dramatically different sides. This one faces Van Wyck, and it has no real presence at all on the park. And that's where we have tended to be the most aggressive in our form making, is the part that has the least significance and is least visible, at least to the historic civic center of Queensborough Hall and Queens Boulevard. This is sort of a quick sketch of our approach to this, whereas the long horizontal curves are those that face the highway, but the building tends to be very well behaved and very constrained when it meets the existing building. And this is the elevation that we're probably most proud of, which is the part that attaches to the existing building, where we try to be as appropriate and as restrained and fit in as much as possible without being particularly noticed. We have another courthouse in Stamford, Connecticut, which is in a residential neighborhood. The drawing to the upper right shows it being in the northern part of downtown Stamford. But the drawing on the left clearly calls for trying to do a very large building in a residential neighborhood, and really its main focus of this building is doing a small town green in this neighborhood. The problem that created for us, given a lot of existing constraints, is we took a perfectly symmetrical building with a lot of efficiency, and because of this town green, forced it into a totally asymmetrical solution and found ways somehow of making the user requirements respond to a condition that had nothing to do with its program intent. It's also a very tall building, and we've used it basically to hide parking from the surrounding residential neighborhoods. Can you get a focus, please? And because of the height and size of this building, it's the main one, the one on the left is another building by another firm. It's really trying to recall the small scale of an older courthouse in the past, and that becomes the primary focus of the town green. If I can return to the large-scale projects quickly, downtown Chicago, another very large battery park city that's called Central Station, 72 acres. It's one that tries very much to interpret Chicago in its very straightforward aspect to its city making and its buildings. This is, in fact, the size of our design, if you can believe that many buildings, by many Chicago architects, I might add. I'm always accused when I come into a new town of being the New York architect. It's going to take all the work away until they realize that what I'm doing is creating a lot of buildings for many local architects. And I want to say that what we have managed to do, and I don't have all the drawings, we have actually completed Burnham's work. It was a gaping hole in his former plan that we have filled in. And we did it by an emphasis again on the public streets and parks that were in his work. And this is the main northern front on Grant Park facing the downtown loop. And these are really what I would like to do, which gives you a little idea of why the interest in urban design and large scale is because I can't help myself but just keep building buildings that never end and go off into these wild tangents. This is the first time I've revealed this publicly, by the way. This is a project that was an invited competition in Toronto, and the project was so large that on our own, without anybody asking, we actually went and invited 4 Toronto architects to join us in the project, which I'm told has never been done by an architect before when they were given a commission and they turned around and split it up amongst many others. And it's all about trying to create this complexity. The plan is much too complicated for me to present to you. It's 4 blocks. I can present about 8 different ways in which you can interpret the plan, but I won't. It comes from an interest in precedence about buildings that made city edges. This was on the edge of Toronto, and how you couldn't really separate one building from another in medieval times. And a lot of these sketches come from these older examples. This is one slide I'm particularly interested in because the residential part is on the lower left, the lower buildings. And we found that because the office building was next to it, we had to bring the residential right up onto the office building because we couldn't find a way of stopping it given the way it would be perceived and how people would live there. So we've affected an office floor plan tremendously by building edges out that begin to appear and act like residential. We didn't have the guts to add the residential to the office floors, but that was the next logical step. And I guess the direction I'm going is that pretty soon buildings won't have any particular uses. We will just use them. And what happens at the base is we couldn't stop the building because it just kept responding to retailing needs, so it started going out in many different directions. But in the end, we were able to behave ourselves very well and present a very good corporate image on the main corporate square, so we have not in any way negated some of the original programming intent. And I'll just end with Battery Park City again. This is my first building in Battery Park City. It's an apartment house. And it's one that's about 5 or 6 different buildings in one. There's all kinds of precedents when you look at older blocks in New York where you never see one big blockbuster building in the past. And we even added the small holdout on the lower right as what one would have normally expected in a city of New York. And so it's taken its place in Battery Park City. I'm told that I'm being accused of breaking my own rules. I hope so. I think that's what they're there for. And it's one that's contributing, I hope, to the complexity and the many ideas of Battery Park City. Thank you.
Stan, you showed us so much. It's sort of hard to know whether to begin with some specific questions about the work or with general things. But let me start by asking you a very general question. What is the guiding principle that informs and controls all of the urban design work you do, your attitude towards cities? I got bits and pieces of it, but if somebody said to you, this is a contest, send in one box top and tell us in 25 words or less how you believe an urban designer should approach cities, what would you say?
I'm sorry I showed that much work to create that kind of question. I think it would be, most of all, to respond to what in fact exists.
Okay. Why does that matter?
Well, if you're a developer or a public official, it's immediate evidence that you'll have a much easier time getting an approval.
Okay.
Because the lessons are clear, that the more one responds to what is there and what people know and understand, the more people can accept change. From my own point of view, I don't think I know another way. So I'm not sure that I'd want to invent a reason to change something that exists for its own sake. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, in effect,
I like what's there usually.
what you're saying is kind of, if it isn't broken, don't fix it.
Yeah. Well, even when people think it's broken, I don't.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And I tend to like probably too much of existing conditions. Maybe it's because I grew up in an area that wasn't so terrific, and I've somehow become acclimated to things that have other qualities. And a lot of those qualities are probably found more in walking the streets and absorbing them maybe more by instinct. And
right.
Therefore you don't tend to be as critical as to want to change it so easily.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I think you're not giving yourself as good a rationale as you might in a way, and that you're kind of talking almost as if you were advocating that, oh, well, we sort of settle for this. You know, you grew up in a certain area and you saw this and that, and that's all you knew, and so you kind of settle for it. At Battery Park City, you had the opportunity to create the ideal. And what you were saying is that the ideal is the conventional in certain ways, or the ideal is related to the conventional more closely than we might have been led to believe heretofore. So maybe another way to put my question is, why are the ideal and the conventional as close to being the same thing as you're suggesting?
Well, I have to say that I, at the time, and still do enjoy and really love New York. So there is first an honesty about responding to where you are and how you feel about it, as opposed to an intellectual drive to want to make a change because someone's given you a commission. I also think that few architects have ever worked in public service, and it's probably ought to be required as part of registration, because you begin to appreciate a lot more all the other views and the difficulty of getting consensus. And so I think you are, and I am, less inclined, given the difficulty and the interest in public life, to want to make dramatic change.
Well, that's sort
also
of,
in Battery Park City, that attempt, the other attempt, had failed.
Well, yeah, we saw before us the whole evidence.
And we only had 12 weeks to do the master plan. You see, so how many ideals can you actually invent in 12 weeks? I don't know.
But that master plan really did turn out to be, I think, a seminal moment in American urban design, because it was Battery Park City, to me at least, was sort of where a lot of the ideas of Jane Jacobs, Robert Venturi, and a number of other people finally achieved built form at true urban scale, and in which you put forth a set of urban values that kind of emerged from some of those ideas, but brought them into something coherent and moved it ahead a certain amount.
Well, I think all of us in the urban design group were there.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't someone suddenly invented this. We were all very involved in the city and enjoyed it and felt like that was the right thing for us to think about. I mean,
there was a point, and now of course this goes back a generation, but there was a point at which it was a fairly radical idea to say what's there is not so bad, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, is Ed Bacon in the audience by any chance? I have to give you a little bit of background.
Sure.
Okay. I grew up in a part of Philadelphia that was called for by Ed Bacon to be demolished. And it was truly one of the wonderful ethnic shopping experiences of Philadelphia. So I came from a
Was that
personal...
South Street in that area?
No, it's North Philadelphia.
North Philadelphia.
Yeah. And so I had lived through personally the experience of the planners, the architects, finding something desperately wrong with what my world was saying was totally right and successful. And so I've always had that background and bias about not wanting to see those kinds of things removed. Right?
Okay.
So there's a little bit of background here.
Right, okay. Yet one of the things that's always impressed me about your take on all of this and your work is that you have not wanted to, or you've not allowed it to go too far in the other extreme. I mean, the Margaret, to go back to the example you showed us, was not built to look like the building it replaced. It is clearly a building that is of this time, that weaves together a certain modern impulse with a sensitivity to the textures and scale of older buildings.
Well, that's when we're doing the urban design projects, we're analyzing the Margaret neighborhood. We're very much caught up in all the familiar historical references. The moment it turns into a specific commission of whether it's open space or building, it's then being built now. And I can't imagine how it is possible, having spent all that time, as we do, interpreting a place,
Right.
looking for an understanding of an essence of it, to then want to copy it would be a sort of a real mockery of it.
Yeah.
So it's immediately a desire to do it in a contemporary way. And in fact, my seeking out my partner Ezra Ehrenkrantz is very much about an interest in technology, of contemporary problems. And to me, the real urban design challenge is finding a way of representing images on a large-scale basis that are more contemporary. I don't think that's possible today. So a lot of our work when we are doing large-scale design has almost too much historic reference. But as soon as we engage the commission on a specific basis, the client is shocked by our sudden radical change of attitude. And in fact, in the Hawaiian project, I think we lost a commission over this.
Because you would not do something that was as literally historical as they wanted.
We could not. And the market in Honolulu clearly was so influenced by the festival marketplace, which was so much about a historic reproduction, that I think we lost the confidence of the client in that case over that issue. But we felt strongly enough about it to stand
And
by it.
you don't seem to do Disneyland at all.
Well, one of our clients now is Disney.
Ah. Well, why should you be different from every other architect?
Well, yeah, they say they search the world, and now with us, And I have to say that it's the work we've done, because we've not got to a building yet, has probably been some of the most creative work that our office has ever been involved with. And the level of thinking has been extraordinary. And I've never had an opportunity to shape outdoor space like this before. But we have a long way to go before we get to the buildings.
No, I mean, the adjective Disneyland.
Well,
Applying
I'm only
to
raising that because I think
a
it's
sort
going
of
to
narrow sphere of architecture that what the Disney company is now commissioning is something else altogether.
Yeah.
What are you? I mean, the Disney company is interesting in part because it is commissioning so little of what we would call Disneyland. I mean, that's what I mean. What are you actually doing for them?
We're doing the new resort and theme park for Southern California on the ocean.
In Long Beach.
Yeah.
Is this the thing around the Queen Mary and the Spruce Goose and everything?
Right. And if you believe it, on the East Coast, we're doing 150 acres of landfill. If that means anything, right? But it's an extraordinary project, and whether they build it is another question, because there's lots of problems associated with it.
Can you say something about what's being planned?
Oh yeah, it's all public.
It is all public?
Yeah.
Oh, give us
Our
that.
name has never appeared on any of the publications, but it is, the drawings are now public, and it's, well, it's a theme park, and it's about 5 different hotel resorts, and it's the first time that Disney has ever, and I think that's the reason we were asked to do it, has ever tried to do Disney with a real city. And we've totally absorbed the city fabric into the resort experience. And I think at first they were probably skeptical of the ability to do that. And now, while there are many other feasibility problems, there is a definite belief that they are able to involve the city in the creation of the special environments for having fun.
Will there be, I mean, people will actually walk the real streets of Long Beach and be in a theme park at the same time?
Yeah. Well, no, the theme park is always separate, but there's a lot of other land that's not the theme park, like down in Walt Disney World. And the public walks everywhere, all the water edges, and yeah, it's a total integrating of the two. Yeah.
What are you doing with the Queen Mary? That's part of it, isn't it?
Well, we're keeping it there afloat. I can't really say that anyone has yet figured out what to do with it, but we're trying.
Okay. From Long Beach to Queens is a leap of one sort. Let's talk a little bit about the Arvern project. Is that going to happen, do you think?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Oh, sure. Is my client out there? Say, no,
tell me a little more about, tell us a little more about it. I was intrigued by your comment that it was a kind of neater, softer, smaller Queens.
Well, it's, if you go out and study Queens, it has a wonderful scale, and the streets are very gentle, and landscape is very much the emphasis. There's a lot of very different inventions on a basic theme of a row house. And we've tried to incorporate a lot of park ideas, both internally as along the beach as well. But it relies on a very conventional marketplace. These are not complicated building types. And as opposed to Battery Park City, where they're much more sophisticated, complex structures. So the design is very much about creating the environment and the opportunities for many different conventional responses. And I'd sort of like to believe that you can make unconventional environments out of conventional parts. And that's pretty much how we're approaching it. So when you ask about the feasibility of Arvern, I think it's very real because it's all conventional. There may be problems in the current marketplace, which we're experiencing everywhere. We're getting, bank loans, et cetera. But the project is very real in the sense of its conventional means, both infrastructure and buildings.
How does it differ conceptually from the Baltimore project, say? Or does it really, except in scale, obviously it does.
Well, Baltimore is higher density than the Queens, and there's a lot more land in Queens. Baltimore is about mixing uses, where Arverne is all residential. Baltimore is basically a mixed-use neighborhood. The Hope is more residential than non-residential. The buildings are really capable of being any use. And the way our work is going, we're believing less and less in use as a idea for planning and even, hopefully, the design of buildings themselves.
Right.
I think this is an extremely important issue. We're doing work in Santa Fe, New Mexico right now. It's, from my point of view, the most sophisticated zoning in America because it does not call out use. But there's every other restriction which creates the real character and environment of the city. Whether it's heights, setbacks, curb cuts, you name it, they got a control for it. But use is left to evolve. And I think we all now, having lived through Soho, and since I and my family live in Tribeca in a building that was designed for a cheese warehouse, we no longer believe that use is the primary consideration.
Right. Even though zoning had its origins in the whole concept of separation of uses. Right.
That would imply it's wrong.
Sorry?
I think it's wrong.
Right. So you really see zoning, in effect, as urban design more than
yeah, very much so.
Right.
I mean, I believe that, and we've seen in New York, we could just about do anything we want with zoning. And the notion of controlling use is really not the primary concern any longer. In my view.
Yeah, I mean, and the truth is, what you're saying has become reality anyway. I mean, zoning.
And it's always changing.
Yeah, I mean,
helpful.
zoning is not about deciding where there are going to be factories and where there are going to be apartments. It has become much more height and bulk and density.
Yeah, I'm sure there's limitations to the line of thinking, but I think that view allows for many more people to participate than the use regulation would normally allow. And it's much more natural evolution of needs and marketplace and people's views about changing times. Whereas you can't change building form that easily.
Right.
You ought to be able to respond at least to changing the uses.
Let's talk a little bit about Battery Park City, because I think most people here probably know it. I'm going to start with a slightly quirky question. It's really become a kind of icon of this time. Do you find that flattering or confining, or a little of both? I mean, do you find that people type you because of that and expect that they'll get, if they call you up, they're calling you up to get a Battery Park City in their city, and that almost prejudges what you're going to produce, or not?
Oh, yeah, and it definitely generates a fear on the part of a lot of other people
okay.
about having a Battery Park City.
I mean, is having created a kind of project of iconographic status almost, does that have a downside as well as an upside?
Oh, definitely it's confining. On the other hand, it does get your name around. But it is confining, but it allows the opportunity to talk what are really the principles behind it and not the specific form. The thing that probably upsets me more than anything else, well, there's two things that upsets me. One is I've never presented Battery Park City in New York. I mean, I think that's kind of interesting. I've presented it all around the country and abroad. New York's never had, as far as I know, a real presentation of Battery Park City. And that's what brings up then my second concern, which is I don't think people understand it. And it's always, I mentioned in the slides, this notion of a grid. It's referred to as this grid. And I've seen reproductions of Battery Park City by people around the country, whether it's in school or in architectural offices. And they have this simplistic grid, and they say it's, this is like Battery Park City. And Battery Park City is much more complicated.
Sure.
It's a grid, yes, I guess, in the sense of
portions
Cartesian
of it, the central
points.
portions of the street pattern are, but...
Well, if you study it, it's never quite on
Right.
the mark.
I mean, Rector Place is slightly askew
everything.
and so forth.
And there's not anything that ever repeats itself, So it's this highly orchestrated design. And the last thing I'd want is for people to say, gee, Battery Park City is a grid, let's just put down a straight orthogonal grid,
Sure,
repetitive
sure.
blocks. That's troublesome.
Well, it's obviously a result of the sloppy level of architecture criticism writing about Battery Park City.
No, I
That's
wouldn't
all.
say
It must
that.
be-
It's
Clearly
I think
must be the carelessness.
No. I
of
think it's the quick reading of the
Right,
material.
right,
Yes.
sure. Well, you're right, though, that in fact one of the strengths of the project is that it is much more subtle than it might appear to be. But I think the real downside of creating an icon, to use that word again, is that when something reaches that level of renown, it tends to be simplified in a kind of sloganeering way, and people glom off the top of it the simplest reading they can. That happens with individual buildings that are very important as well. I mean,
Sure.
Philip Johnson's glass house, people misunderstand in many ways too. I mean, almost anything that becomes famous and has meanings beyond itself, there's a downside as well as an upside.
It just would be better if people understood that what's to be remembered about Battery Park City are the public spaces. And if those public environments would be repeated, that would be okay.
Yeah, it seemed to me, though, that if anything, the critical idea was not the physical plan, it was the idea that the public realm comes first.
Absolutely.
And the private realm is fitted in around the public realm, as opposed to the other way around, which is how it's usually done in new projects.
In all of our work, we are constantly drawing and making models of the spaces and not the buildings, and the buildings are then the product of the spaces.
Right.
And they eventually become buildings in their own right and have their own set of problems, and they're very real. But the instinct, and it's true in our courthouses and our schools, has been on shaping outdoor space first.
Right.
And you begin to discover there's a whole world of forces there that you could, in fact, respond to and make real buildings out of, as all the old buildings of New York, I believe, did very well.
Right. Shaping outdoor public space before private space, and then also I think the idea that the whole was more than the sum of the parts, that individual buildings defer to a larger whole. And I think that it's those two concepts that seem to me to come way before the grid or anything specific about the pattern.
There's a lot of people that then go on to say that, well, let's therefore not presume that we will have great architecture. Because that, as at least it's been popularly presented, might suggest that the environment might suffer, which of course I don't believe in, but there is that response. And even, Lou Kahn said something to that effect, that great cities don't rely on great buildings. And that's a bit troublesome.
The great cities don't rely on great buildings.
Right.
Well, it's two separate issues here. One of them is whether the restrictions and guidelines that Battery Park City lays before architects need to prevent great architecture. I don't know that they have to, any more than the rules of writing a sonnet prevent great poetry. I mean,
Yeah, they don't have to. They don't preclude it.
Right.
I don't believe they preclude it. And I think maybe all of us that have responded to the guidelines so far have been intimidated by them, because it really was the first time in certainly this generation of architects that we're suddenly given a whole set of rules.
Right.
And I think a lot of us were unwilling to challenge them.
Right.
Now, I am being criticized because of this building somehow is breaking the rules. It's not true. It's not breaking the rules, but there's an interpretation of it. And I sort of feel like that was the right response if I pushed it, because that's what they're there for.
Right.
They're not absolute zoning requirements.
And also, I mean, the whole point of the guidelines was not to actually design the buildings.
No, not at all.
For the architects, but to sort of challenge them to work within a certain framework, but within that to be creative and indeed to be as different as they possibly could while respecting certain common principles.
Well, in fact, there was one architect who did one of the buildings on Rector Place, he'll remain nameless, who said to me after hearing the presentation to all the developers at the first meeting, they came up to me and said, you know, you've taken all the fun away.
Mm-hmm.
And my response to him was, just wait. And later he came back and said, in fact, I've never been asked in a spec residential building to have done as much detailed design and be concerned with as many issues of design as we were. So it was just a different set of problems were being asked to be solved.
And to say to an architect, you do not have a complete blank slate, is not to take the fun away, I don't think, or need not be to take the fun away.
No, in fact, I think, you know, and a lot of people have written about this, the more rules there are, the more freedom there is.
I like that.
And that's an interesting topic. We can talk a lot about that, and probably a lot of architects will disagree, but I truly believe in it, and I think it's proven itself.
Right. We have a lot of interesting questions, and if there are any more, by the way, please continue to pass them up. But let's turn to them at this point, since we have a lot to get through here. Do you have a favorite and or least favorite New York City edge?
You know, I have all kinds of edges that I like about New York. I don't think I can answer that question. To me, the city is all edges, and there are all kinds of edges, and that's basically what I draw, so I don't know how to answer that. I guess the fact that I usually go on a Circle Line tour every year to draw probably means that that's the edge I enjoy the most.
Do you do it with earplugs to keep the guide out of your?
Well, as many of my former students know, what we used to do was pull the plug out on the Circle Line tour, and we would draw, and that's how we did it. You know?
Right. Okay. This next question actually takes us to an edge. The writer refers to it as a highly loaded question,
Probably is.
but I will present it to you anyway. It says, what do you think is the future of the Penn Yard site?
The future is in the process of being decided, I suspect.
That's
Not a good answer. That's
far
the answer I'll
too
give.
self-consciously Confucian an answer.
No. I don't think I want to answer that question.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I may come back to it again. Tell us more about Edmund Bacon. What was his contribution to Philadelphia?
Well, one thing, he encouraged me to move to New York.
So we know what his contribution to New York was, but the question was what
It
was
may
it?
have been a contribution to Philadelphia. I don't know. Well, he certainly brought the name of planning to the city and helped the city present itself as a place of significant thinking and involvement of architecture with political force. And to me, that was a great success. And having been a part of a time in New York where architects were indeed influential in a political process, is probably the most important thing that certainly happened in my career, and I think for a good part of New York, it was extremely helpful. And it's obviously lacking today.
What do you think Bacon would have done if he had been in New York?
He probably would have tried to instill too much order. And that would go absolutely the opposite of how I perceive New York, which is nothing but this, this crazy quilt of chaotic pieces, and yet they work. And that's the way of thinking about planning here.
Sort of planned anarchy in a certain way.
A bit. I mean, you have to be sure the roads and the subways work and the utilities, but after that, the city is so complex. That's what's so wonderful about it. And the zoning doesn't allow enough response to that complexity. But that's the way the planning and then the zoning should follow.
Yeah, one of my problems with Bacon has always been that he doesn't understand that. I mean, he seeks a kind of, as Mumford did, seeks a kind of rational order over everything.
Yeah, I don't understand quite why, because he obviously lives in downtown Philly, and I think if you live in a city, it's hard to imagine that kind of order coming out of your real experience. You know, my sense of the urban renewal in the 60s and Battery Park City was that it was all done by people who lived in the suburbs because they were seeking to clean up the city and make it into something that was more suburban. And he is an inner city resident.
I think it's not so much a question of city versus suburban sensibilities as it is a question of utopian sensibilities versus something else. I think Bacon, as Mumford was, is primarily a utopian and tends to believe that we are living in an imperfect world that our goal is to somehow make more perfect.
And maybe he had more the opportunity to think that way and be that way. I personally have not had that opportunity.
Sure.
Look forward to it maybe.
Let's go back to Queens with this question. Are the buildings in Arverne, Queens to be privately owned, or is it a city-owned project? Will the apartments be rented without income limitations?
It's at the moment it's essentially a marketplace development, responding entirely to what the current market and future markets will bear. It's meant to be owned by individual homeowners, apartment owners. But again, the marketplace might in fact change that over time. But it's never been seen as a development where there would be public subsidy.
Okay, good.
By the way, that means for Arverne, as compared to Battery Park City, it's much more of a affordable kind of large-scale design. It's not presuming the kind of budgets that we were able to enjoy in Battery Park City for the type of infrastructure, even though relatively speaking, there's been a lot of effort and care in the design of the infrastructure, seeing that's what's creating the value. So there's a lot of similar principles, but it is a more affordable version of a large-scale project.
You know, Battery Park City has, I think, justly been criticized for having fairly ordinary apartments, despite the good quality of the overall urban design. Given the economic realities of it, would there have been any way to have made the units themselves better without sacrificing any of the other things you were doing?
Oh, the opportunities were there, but again, it was a marketplace issue. The plan certainly does not preclude any kind of interior attitudes to occur. But there was a specific, however, reluctance implied in the plan to not interfere with the private aspects of the project.
Right.
And one of the things that's implied in all of our work, and I hope it comes out, is that there needs to be a definite distinction between private and public, and they should not be confused. That's what makes a much more successful public environment, when the lines are drawn clearly and we're not asking private to do the things that public needs to do.
Your own building now under construction notwithstanding, do you have a favorite building at Battery Park City?
Yeah, I do. It's probably the one that most architects don't like.
Which one is that?
It's Charles Moore's building.
The Charles Moore building?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, as part of the process, I guess, besides the fact of liking it, Charles was the only architect, I believe, who truly enjoyed having the guidelines.
Right.
And in fact...
You understood immediately that this was not
It's not a constraint.
Some
it was,
nasty plot
no.
against him. But
No, in fact, he said, just tell me more, give me more, and then made about 20 copies of the guidelines and distributed them to all the cities in Southern California he was working in, and said, this is what you need to do, and I'm delighted to be able to do buildings within that context. And it was really a joy, because I also believe that he went beyond the guidelines. And, you know, I'm personally looking for, in our works, to engage as many ideas as possible.
Sure.
And if they don't fit, that's okay.
Right.
That's better.
It'd be interesting to explore this with Moore when he is here in February. But I always had a sense that Charles Moore looked at those guidelines kind of like Houdini, you know, tie me up and watch me get out, was sort of his way of.
Well, I think it's a lot like, you know, most architects would agree that the more you have to respond to, the better the design, right, even though you're looking for clarity and simplicity. And I think that's how he engages it. The experience was so good that Charles and I are doing work together in two other projects. Right. And one he suggested, one I suggested. So, yeah.
Let's return to your questions here with this one. What if the marketplace doesn't improve and affordability becomes a permanent factor? Does the architect step in and help create a building technology that can meet these needs?
Well, I don't know if I'll be in practice if this keeps up. This question of affordability is one that's we're very involved with as a firm. It comes from Ezra's background in building systems, and we are dealing with a number of different types of developers in pursuing how this issue of affordability can be dealt with, whether it's modular, or it's a building system from Europe, or it's working with two-story frame construction. We're doing, in our own way, helping out as many different ways as possible. But I don't know that we can do much more than helping to keep costs down without a sacrificing of the public environment.
Right. Okay. Good. You talked about designing public spaces, but how do you engage the public in your design process?
This is a very sensitive issue. Battery Park City would not have happened if we had a public review. The South residential area, which is what I worked on primarily, did go through a public process, as opposed to the total master plan. You might remember that, Paul. I believe that the reason we got the approvals we did is that nobody believed that Battery Park City was going to happen. And so it wasn't taken as seriously. Now, I also believe that people were indeed pleased with what they saw. But I want to mention two things in the public environment. The esplanade that I designed initially with Battery Park City Authority did not go through a public review process. It went through Parks Department, but not through a public review process. And even in the Parks Department, there was a lot of resistance from certain staff that it was violating all the standards at the time of the Parks Department. The South Cove, which I did with Mary Miss and Susan Childs, in my opinion, would never have gotten built if it went through a public process. Right. And I was participating in a conference with artists a couple years ago in North Carolina, and people were outraged by my saying this, that kind of collaboration and involvement in public work could not go through a public process. In fact, this was a conference devoted to the notion of artists participating in public. And unfortunately, this is a very difficult question, but I think it's really true that a lot of things that we did in the South Cove are much too fragile and much too unconventional to be familiar enough for people to say, I understand it, and therefore I agree with it.
Isn't there kind of paradox here? Because we've been talking about how your work responds to and uses convention, and yet you're telling me it is in some ways too unconventional for the public to accept.
Well, I started out with my first sketch, and I wanted to create the impression right then and there that I'm totally confused on a lot of points myself, and this is really an issue, because I think at a large-scale plan, there can be enough familiar aspects to it that it is approved. But when you get down to more and more of the developing of the space into something quite tangible with a definite sense of expression and character, then you're engaging a whole other set of problems that are not easy for people to accept. And unless you want to do a reproduction of something where you could point to a photograph and say, that's what we will do, then I think it's a lot easier to get approved.
Right.
And I don't want to leave the impression that public approval is something that is wrong or difficult. And I feel like I enjoy it, I'm involved with it, it is my work. But it also has clearly limitations, and I'm glad to get work that does not involve public process. Just like I'm glad I have work that does have public process.
Right, okay, good.
Is there a tape being made of this? I'm saying a lot of things I'm going to be sorry about.
Since there isn't, how about this question? What do you think of the future of the Penn Yard site?
Oh, God. Well, I don't know how to, I really, Paul, I don't know how to respond. I'm obviously delighted that there is a lot of local involvement because I think there's a lot of local intelligence. And the more that that can be brought into the design, the better.
Right.
The movement to rely more on successful precedents is something that I do in my work.
Sure.
And to the extent that that can inform the evolution of the plan, I think that's exactly right. But I don't know that much more for me to respond beyond saying that those moves make a lot of sense.
Okay.
And my only hope is that we don't just literally take Riverside Park and just say we do more of that, because it's not the same situation. And one of the things you had asked before about, reproducing Battery Park City, I feel that while on the one hand I was quite pleased that the city took the seawall of Battery Park City and repeated it on the East River along the promenade there, I felt that that was the wrong thing to have done. That curve was really designed more in the sense of a much larger expanse of water,
Right.
in much more of a quiet setting and much more of a romantic setting. Whereas along the highway on the East River, my sense was, while the colors and materials might be right, the forms had to be much more of a harsh place and not try to just reproduce something. So that
Yeah, it's interesting because what appeared so strong at Battery Park City had a slight taint of the cute.
yeah, and I
on
think
the
it
east
took
side,
away
in that other context.
and it took away from Battery Park City.
Yeah, I think
we're
that's right.
we're doing the design of Battery Park. We've done a design of Battery Park. We're hoping it gets built. And the esplanade and the seawall, even at Battery Park, is a very different design than Battery Park City. Materials carry forward, but the setting is much more important. And we've responded to that, majestic place in a way that Battery Park City does not.
Right. Good. Let's take a step back and away from specific projects with this question. What is the best education and training for an urban designer?
Well, you could have taken my urban design program at Columbia when I was there.
Now that you're no longer there,
Now I'm no
what is
longer
the
there.
best education and training?
I think it's a real problem. I don't know that it exists. And not because I'm not teaching it, I just from my own observations about it. You can do the same training that I and a lot of other people did, which is we never took an urban design program. We went through the most traditional architectural training and then went and spent 4 years in the urban design group in New York City. And that for me was a most difficult period because I had been told that I would move to New York and design buildings in Manhattan, and instead I was handed a zoning ordinance. And that took a long time to recover from. And, but I learned in that process about urban design. So that may be the best way.
Right. Okay. This question is about the regional mall. Does a regional mall have the potential to become an urban place?
I don't think so. It's not a public place, and it's not based on many people participating in shaping the environment. So I think it strikes at the very essence of public, meaning lots of things and people and ideas coming together, sharing a common space. And therefore, all the things fall away if it's not rooted like that.
What about Newport, which you are doing in Jersey City?
The mall was done before.
All right, so you have
we
nothing
got
to do with the
involved.
mall. I mean, did you come in there, in effect, to try to bring some urban qualities to a fundamentally suburban place?
Yeah, I think the reason we were invited in is there was growing criticism of a plan that was mostly suburban. It had three aspects to it that made it suburban. One was a shopping mall. Two was a very large curving boulevard that was more what you would find in a suburban environment. And it had object towers placed in open fields. And,
not a lot you can do with that as givens, is there?
Well, I'm sorry I didn't bring the plan. Yeah, what we did was we added a great variety of street types, much smaller spaces. What we did is we reduced the amount of open space significantly. Gave it a lot of shape, a lot of different characteristics, and in so doing, created a place that you could walk. And that's what made the fundamental change. And the perception of walking was one where distances were no longer as large. They were much more varied experiences, and you had reasons to go from one point to the next. That has shaped the plan into an urban place now.
Has that pretty much been finished now?
Well, the market's changed a lot of things. We're doing one office tower, which is the entrance to the shopping mall, and it connects the PATH subway with the mall. All the other buildings really are on hold. We've done a number of landscape pieces, and it's basically waiting for the marketplace to return.
Okay, good. We have time for just a couple more, so let's give you these. One of them is, how would you approach the space of the Brooklyn Heights Navy Yard?
The piers.
The Brooklyn Heights Piers, I guess that the questioner means, yeah. Piers.
Well, actually, I did a design for that. It was an effort where some people were doing some thinking about it. I did not think it was appropriate to follow the rules that are currently in place, which are, from what I understand, highly favored by the local community, because I felt that they did not respond enough to the particulars of the existing conditions. And felt that there was a great deal of variety that was called for, and that tall buildings were not inappropriate. They just had to be carefully positioned. And I also felt that it should not be a great deal of public space. I am not a believer in a lot of public space. I find, given our resources today, that unless you can really do a major park, you're better off reducing the amount of public space so that you can really get a handle on it, maintain it, and control it.
Do it well.
Do it very well. And I think Rockefeller Center has clearly proven that point beyond anyone's.
As it proves every sensible point.
Yeah.
Let me give you this as a final question. What was it about your neighborhood in North Philadelphia that made architects feel it was architecturally incorrect and worthy of demolition? And is there a comparable neighborhood in New York?
Well, the closest is Orchard Street. The thing I think that people really responded to was, A, there were real push carts out on the street, which looked awful, I suspect. There were also older buildings, which today would be charming, but at that time, this was before Society Hill even.
Right.
And because also there were uses like live chicken markets and live fish markets and all that, this obviously was dirty. And for me, they were the joy of my childhood because I would spend all my time in these live markets. So those are probably what I would think made sense, because there certainly was very active businesses and people were paying taxes and people lived above the stores and all that. So.
all that dirty stuff that planners were devoted to getting rid of.
Yeah, now we're putting them back.
And now we're putting back, exactly. Great. Good. It's a good note on which to conclude, I think. Stan, thank you very much for being here. Please join me in thanking Stan Eckstut. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Okay.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.